Listen up, folks. Today I wanted to put together my thoughts after finally finishing Monster Hunter Stories 2. It was a lot longer than I expected, but that was a positive for me because I actually adored this game. It was a lot more than I expected it to be, and it ended up kind of really getting me going and excited. And I'm looking forward to the next one as well. So what we'll do this video is we'll cover, after finishing the main story, I think it took about 45-50 hours to finish the whole game. It's quite a long game actually, but we'll go through everything that I liked, everything that I didn't like, and everything in between, so that you kind of just, you know, if that's useful for you, why not? Let's talk about it. Monster Hunter Stories 2 is a sequel to the original Monster Hunter Stories 1, obviously. I never played the first one, but the second one came out as a sequel, and it's basically a turn-based RPG similar to your kind of monster collector games. Pokemon probably being the most memorable, but obviously there's been plenty more in that genre. But you basically work through an entire story campaign, collecting monsters, building your party up, and doing turn-based RPG along the way. And the idea here is that you're collecting monsters from the Monster Hunter universe. So all the ones that, if you're a Monster Hunter fan, that you are used to in all the generations, many of the most recent ones will show up here, and you can collect them and then have them as a sidekick or as a partner in combat. And then you'll be using turn-based rock, paper, scissors style combat. So you have like red beats green, green beats blue, blue beats red kind of thing. You have different kinds of attacks. You will get most of the weapons, weapon types at least, that you'd get from Monster Hunter. So you have a great hammer, a great sword, sword and shield. You have the hunting horn. You have the gun lance, things like that. And then they use those attack types, whether it's blunt, piercing, or slashing, to affect different parts of the monsters. But let's get into the gameplay, and you know, I guess we'll start with kind of the overall review of it. The game is very true to the franchise. So if you're someone who does like Monster Hunter, I think that this game will hit the nail right on the head. It's all you expect from the game. You're basically hunting monsters, collecting parts. You're breaking parts off the monsters to get different parts. And as you go through the world, you encounter new monsters that have different requirements for victory, right? Like different parts of them are weak. If you learn what they're weak to, you can punish them. And then you can kind of make them run away, collect their eggs, and collect different monsters along the way. So it is very true to the Monster Hunter IP. I don't think it's anywhere near the same level of difficulty or necessity, but I think that this game is targeted at a much younger audience. Typically these monster collector games are either you've been playing them your whole life, and you're kind of an adult now that just loves playing these, or they have that kind of more childlike approach where you get to you know, simplified story themes, a very positive, cheerful attitude, and then mechanics that are easy to grasp, and have a little bit of depth, so that if you're on the younger side of the generation, then it's easier for you to pick up and really enjoy. There's nothing in this game that I think is overly harsh or extremely challenging, that, you know, someone who has just started playing games wouldn't be able to pick up. I think all the monsters were well represented. Again, very true to the franchise in that regard. Most of the monsters that, if you recognize them, like on screen here, you see a Ludroth, you see a Legiana, Yankaku, like you're going to have these, they look almost exactly like you'd expect from the universe. And I think that they are as true to form in this different style of game as they possibly could be. The combat was just challenging enough. I think for me, I wish there were more difficulty, like optional difficulty options that would have allowed for, you know, higher difficulty scaling, because oftentimes I was able to, without much prep, be able to one-shot most of the bosses. I do wish that there was like a harder way, you know, kind of like a Nuzlocke or some kind of way to scale it. And maybe there is, and I just missed it, but I looked for any difficulty scalers and I couldn't find any. So it was just kind of like this. Now it wasn't a huge detriment, but I was kind of craving that Monster Hunter, I have to be prepared or else I'm going to die kind of feeling. And I didn't really get that very often from most of the encounters, but I did have a lot of fun along the way doing the combat, learning the monsters, reacting to them. And I did die, you know, 2 or 3 times. So it definitely had that moment, which was, you still have to kind of know what you're going into, But there was a little bit of difficulty in some of the encounters, and if you weren't prepared or didn't have the right item, like you would in Monster Hunter, there's definitely some of that in there. Now, I'll only be showing you early game footage here on screen, just so there's no spoilers or anything. This is just very early, you know, like within the first day of playing, what you'd run into and just early creatures. That way there's no spoilers. But I think the story was actually surprisingly good. It was something that I found myself very curious about. They did a really good job in storytelling, which is something you don't get in games very often, where they have an overarching story that you're following and, you know, trying to figure out. And then there's like these small chapters that you go through that are matched up. I think in most RPGs, this relationship between the smaller chapters into the overarching story, there's a little bit of mismatch usually, or you go through a chapter you don't care much about, or, you know, you're not interested in the overarching story, so you're just kind of there to grind. But I think they did a really good job of breadcrumbing you along through the story, keeping you interested, having new developments come along regularly, so you're kind of curious about what's happening, surprises you didn't expect, which makes you even more excited to see what's next, and then, you know, individual things along the way that you're discovering and encountering that make you feel really good about it. So, you know, for your 50 to 60 hour playthrough, you're still, you know, finding out new things along the way, which is a really, honestly, is actually pretty challenging. And you don't always get that from RPG games. The way the combat works is you have 3 primary weapons equipped. I just went through with a basic, I kept one of each weapon type, the blunt, slashing, and piercing the whole way through, so that I was never, you know, if I needed a specific one, I wasn't caught out. But you could have multiple of the same kind. And just like in Monster Hunter, you can craft the weapons out of the monsters you kill, and the same for the armor. And they all have different passives and effects, and different stats and benefits. So learning kind of which, you know, encountering a new monster means that you get new gear, and you can use that new gear in different ways, which is pretty cool. You are a rider, which means that you tame monsters and keep them as a partner that you kind of can mount and ride around. And usually in most of your encounters, you will be with one more rider. This is an NPC that plays with you, but it could be a person on the multiplayer side. And they are also usually a rider, which means they have a monster as well. You do have portions of the game that you go through with a monster hunter, which is someone who doesn't tame monsters. Obviously, they kill them. So you're down to 3 players or 3 characters in your party. But it didn't feel like that much of a detriment. I think they did a good job of keeping that interesting and unique. Each partner you get throughout the story, times where, you know, a partner, you're done with an area, so that partner stays in that area. You go to a new area, which means you get a new partner. That partner brings in new abilities and new items that they carry, and new ways to combo with them, which made the game feel unique every step of the way. Every time you went to a new chapter area, it definitely felt interesting and different than the last one, just for that reason, right? Your party changes every time you go to a new location. And the hunters themselves ended up kind of balancing out. They did more damage and they had a little bit more health. And then they still had a lot of the basics you would need to combo with. The combat is, like I said, a Rochambeau rock, paper, scissors. You have a strong attack or strength attack, a power attack, into a technical attack, into a speed attack. And it's this rock, paper, scissors circle of beating each other. You can see it on screen there in the top left, how blue beats red, red beats green, green beats blue. So if you attack into what's called a head-to-head, which means that a monster is targeting you, and you beat them with the correct attack, then you will trigger a head-to-head victory, which means that you'll lessen the damage you take and deal more damage and build your kinship meter, which is basically your ultimate charge. It's these blue circles at the bottom of the screen. It fills up to the max, and then you can use that for abilities. It's almost like your mana, but if you fill it up to the top, then you'll be able to use your ultimate ability, which is a combo of you and the monster you currently have out. And later in the game, you get up to 6 monsters in your party. So you can actually have a lot of variety in how you combo together. If you and a monster you're with, either your partner's monster or your monster, do the same attack into an attack that's a strength, like beats their attack, right? So if they attack you with power and both of you and your monster attack back with speed, which beats it, you'll trigger a double attack, which cancels their attack entirely. You won't take any damage and gives you a bunch of extra meter. And because the meter is used for abilities and for various benefits, you're highly encouraged to learn how the rock, paper, scissors works, and then also learn the attack patterns of the monsters, right? You know this is a strength monster. When they become enraged, they turn into a technical attack. Then they have different attack patterns after that. So if you can learn, since you don't know what they're going to attack with until you've already selected your turn, if you attack wrong and lose the head-to-head, you'll take extra damage, right? You can see all these head-to-heads going off here. So I think this is a really cool turn-based tactical approach to include the Monster Hunter main shtick, which is learning the weaknesses and strengths of your prey and then using them against them, right? So you learn that, okay, this Royal Ludroth we're facing normally does power attacks, so we need to be responding with speed attacks and vice versa. And you can also, use an ultimate with your partner, and then that gives you like a double ultimate, which is like crazy powerful. So you're very much incentivized to learn that pattern system and remember how monsters work. And there's a lot of ways to mix that up as you run into variants or deviants of the same species. And then when you run into bosses that change based on, story elements that I won't get into that make it a little bit more unique and interesting. So I think from that standpoint, it's a very simple system. It works excellently. It's rewarding and fun. It's not overly taxing. And I think it fits the universe really well, which adds to the whole idea that you're playing a monster collector RPG in the universe of Monster Hunter. I think all of that plays really well together. The monster collector aspect itself of collecting eggs, hatching them, looking for specific starting stats. It was almost like a gacha game light. It wasn't as complicated as a gacha game, but each monster had a rarity attached to it, which affected scaling in some way. They had attack stats, defense stats, speed, HP, and weaknesses. And they also had a gene pool, which is the genes they come with that can strengthen. They gave you the abilities, they gave you passives, and they give you benefits. And then there's like this little mini bingo chart system where if you line up a lot of the same kind of gene, either diagonally or across or up and down in this 9-point gene grid, you'd get benefits and scalars. So you're kind of encouraged to find monsters with the genes you need, and then you have a process that allows you to extract those genes and give them to your monsters that you have in your main party. So you're kind of encouraged to find as many monsters as you can, look for good genes, look for better starting stats, look for higher rarities, and then merge the genes together and level them up to get your monsters to be stronger for the game. So I think, again, that kind of really plays into the monster collector aspect. And I was very much, I felt the urge to go and collect as many as I could to get the right genes. So I think the system was working pretty well. But as with all RPG systems do, there's benefits and there's weaknesses. So let's talk about some of the things I didn't like or things that I thought could have been done better. Since we're on the topic of the gene and the stats and kind of mini gacha system, let's talk about that. I think it ended up being that a large amount of the genes were less useful than I thought they were, or I wanted them to be. And I think the reason for this was they had a built-in progression system for the monsters as you progress through the game. And I think this is useful for someone who isn't all that interested in getting the best monster or planning or beefing up monsters. So the way it worked is that the early game monsters were actually significantly weaker than the late game monsters. In a lot of ways. This meant that if you had a monster that was your favorite, but it was kind of like an early game monster during the campaign process, it would just have weaker stats and usually would not scale as well. So you'd have to kind of upgrade to the new monsters. Now, this helps people that don't want to, min-max everything. It means that as they go through the story, they can collect new monsters. The new monsters they collect are going to be inherently stronger, which means their party gets stronger and they don't have to spend as much time grinding. Which means if you just want a casual playthrough through the game, it will reward you for doing so, and it'll be pretty smooth and streamlined along that path. But if you have like a specific monster you like I love the Nargacuga, there wasn't really a Nargacuga I could find that was ever going to be as strong as a Nergigante or any of the late game monsters. And I got to about 75% through the story where I wanted my Nargacuga to be good, but he was just too weak. I just couldn't keep him going. I had to nix him and throw him out. So that was definitely a negative on that front, but it didn't detract from it too much. Now, they did have items that allowed you to beef up the natural stats, and you can use, I think, 10 of these on each unit and yourself. Before it was a permanent upgrades, but you can only do 10 times. So that did help some of the early game units or mid game units if you wanted to keep them in your party longer. But obviously you can just use those on the late game units and they'll just be that much better, right? So there's definitely this encouragement to constantly be upgrading with new monsters, which you don't always have with every Pokemon game. I mean, you can't always be Ash with a Pikachu that faces off against, you know, an Onix, but you oftentimes can pick up a Pokemon or a monster or a slime or whatever it is, whatever game you're playing that you like the most, and kind of beef it out along the way. And I think one of the biggest flaws with the game was more around the availability of every type of monster in the first half of the game. So you start out with a speed-based monster. All the monsters have one of the 3 types as their base, which means that if you just swapped them, their first attack will be in their natural state. So if you see that, you know, you're being attacked with a technical, which loses to power, and you don't have any monster that can do power, you swap to one that's a power base, its first attack will be power, and then you can win a head-to-head or get a double attack very easily. The problem is most of the monsters you encounter up until probably the 60%, 70% story progression level, like towards the end of the game, are either technical or power. There are actually very few monsters that you'll be able to collect that are speed, which means that if you want to use the speed monsters, you have a very small selection of which ones are available. And I think from the same standpoint too, there are special moves, just like in Pokemon, where the monsters can jump over obstacles or swim or break rocks to reveal paths or dig or things like that. And there was not a very good distribution of those either. Jump specifically, I think for the first half of the game, there's only like 1 or 2 monsters that are easy to get that have jump. So if you wanted jump in your party to go over those obstacles and collect any loot, you kind of were forced to choose those specific monsters to be in your party. So I think if they could bring some of the distribution between those, I don't even know if it matters for this game, but in the next games, that was kind of a nitpicky point for me, is that I wish that the distribution was better so that it was a little bit more varied on whether you could use all 3 types in an effective way, and then also be able to use all the different abilities like jumping and swimming and digging and that kind of thing. And I think that best summarizes my gripes with the game. I think overall, I loved this game. I had a great time with it. I highly, highly, highly recommend it if you're a fan of Monster Collector RPGs or turn-based RPGs, or even if you're a fan of Monster Hunter IP in general. I think this game is awesome. It's very, very good. And the only things that I could, that I had gripes on were mostly around progression overall. Some of the progression kind of felt bumpy at times, where you didn't get access to things you probably needed, or there weren't a good distribution or spread of the things that you wanted to choose from, which, it in the grand scheme of things is relatively minor. And then having optional difficulty increases, because I definitely did not feel highly pressured to have the right weapon or the right armor or have the right preparation for every fight. I kind of just breezed through the game. It didn't mean that there weren't, difficult parts. It didn't mean I didn't die, but I definitely didn't have that. I didn't really ever hit a challenge wall where I felt like, oh, I should go grind, or I should go get, prepare myself properly. I kind of just cruised through the whole thing. And I wish that there were more Nuzlocke style things where you could, apply challenges to yourself that, weren't just self-imposed. They're part of the game, and also just kind of force you to play within the Monster Hunter aesthetic of constantly changing based on what you're facing off against. And that does it for my review of Monster Hunter Stories 2. Like I said, this game owns. It's amazing. So pick it up. Highly recommend it. There's not a lot of bad things I can say about it. It is exactly what it needs to be for the genre, for the price. You get a lot of value. You can end up spending, 60 to 100 plus hours in this game, because there is a lot of end game content. There's high rank monsters. There's things you can collect. There's elder dragons. So you can actually kind of progress just like you would in a normal Monster Hunter game. And there were very few perceivable bugs. I ran into some, but obviously having been a developer myself, I'm going to recognize bugs that players may not notice just for having that experience. But that none of those really detracted from it. It ran well. It performed well. It functioned well. It satisfied that itch. It worked. It was visually stunning. It was awe-inspiring. This game was just, it's hard to really overstate how much this game was satisfying for me. So that's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you found this review useful, please leave a like down below, and I will see you in the next one. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.